October 3rd, 1993, Mogadishu, Somalia. American helicopters descended into the heart of the city for what was supposed to be a 90-minute raid. 17 hours later, 18 Americans would be dead, 2 helicopters destroyed, and the United States would begin its withdrawal from Somalia. This is the story of how Somali fighters turned an American special operations raid into one of the most significant tactical defeats in modern U.S. military history. But to understand what happened on that day, you need to understand what led to it. Somalia in 1993 was a nation in chaos. General Mohammed Siad Barre had ruled for decades by inciting one clan against another, weakening potential enemies by turning them against each other. When his regime collapsed and he fled, a power vacuum followed. Warlords emerged, interclan killings followed. Without security, food couldn't reach those who needed it. Relief convoys were looted, ships delivering aid were shelled, a man-made famine unfolded. American troops arrived in December 1992 under Operation Restore Hope. By May 1993, with violence and famine waning, most American forces withdrew. The UN took over peacekeeping. But the mission changed. The UN mandate shifted to peace enforcement under Chapter 7, authorizing the use of force to actively disarm militias. The UN's role transformed from mediator to player. General Mohammed Farah Aidid commanded the Somali National Alliance. The SNA had emerged as the dominant force in Mogadishu. Aidid controlled Radio Mogadishu and used it effectively, accusing the UN and US of being aggressors trying to colonize Somalia. The UN decided the radio station was a military target. On June 5, 1993, Pakistani troops were ordered to inspect it. The day before, Aidid's head of security received notification. His response? This would mean war. Pakistani troops were met with roadblocks and coordinated ambushes. 24 Pakistani soldiers were killed. The UN response was overwhelming. A C-130 gunships with 105mm cannons attacked Aidid's strongholds. Hundreds of Somali civilians died. The UN intended to weaken Aidid. They achieved the opposite. The civilian casualties turned him into a hero. Somalis who had been neutral now rallied to him. Task Force Ranger arrived in late August 1993, 440 elite troops from Delta Force and Army Rangers. Their mission was to capture Aidid and his lieutenants. They operated from the airport base, ready to deploy within minutes. The Americans conducted multiple raids throughout September. They would arrive in helicopters, fast rope down, capture targets, and extract via convoy. The raids followed a pattern that Somali fighters studied carefully. Aidid's militia observed everything. They noted helicopters always flew low and slow during insertions. They watched the Americans' tactics and timing. Most importantly, they realized the helicopters were vulnerable. The Black Hawks hovered in predictable patterns, and Somali fighters had RPG-7s. The RPG wasn't designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, but Somali fighters discovered if you fired enough at a slow-moving helicopter, eventually you'd hit something critical. The tail rotor was especially vulnerable. One hit to the tail boom could send a helicopter spinning out of control. Aidid's forces also understood American doctrine. The Americans would never leave their own behind. If a helicopter went down, massive forces would converge for rescue. That predictability could be exploited. Intelligence indicated Aidid was meeting with 20 lieutenants near the Olympic Hotel in the Bakar Market area, deep in his territory. At 3:32 p.m., 17 helicopters took off from the American base. 12 vehicles departed as the extraction convoy. The Americans came in fast and loud. The entire neighborhood heard the helicopters. Rangers fast roped into the streets. Delta operators breached the building, capturing 24 Somali men. The raid went smoothly. Within minutes, prisoners were being loaded into trucks. But Aidid wasn't there. Somali fighters mobilized immediately. This wasn't spontaneous. Militia forces moved to predetermined positions. Roadblocks went up at intersections. Fighters with AK-47s took positions in buildings. RPG gunners moved where they could target helicopters. The Americans had walked into the most hostile neighborhood with limited ammunition, no night vision, and many Rangers had removed back armor plates because of the heat. They thought they'd be out in 90 minutes. Super 6-1, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Cliff Wolcott, was providing covering fire for the ground forces when an RPG hit its tail rotor. The helicopter didn't explode dramatically. It just started spinning. The pilot had no control. The Black Hawk spun in a slow, sickening rotation before crashing into a neighborhood a few blocks from the target area. For Somali fighters, the sight of an American helicopter falling from the sky was electrifying. The Americans weren't invincible. The helicopters that had terrorized neighborhoods for months could be brought down. Word spread instantly through the district. The crash site became the focal point. Rangers and Delta operators fought through narrow streets to reach the downed helicopter. Somali militia and armed civilians converged on the same location from every direction. Freedom Road and the adjoining alley became a killing zone. Somali fighters didn't employ sophisticated tactics. They didn't need to. They had overwhelming numbers and they knew the terrain. Fighters would expose themselves just long enough to fire an AK-47 burst around a corner, then pull back. RPG gunners targeted not just the helicopters overhead, but the American positions on the ground. The volume of fire was extraordinary. American helicopter door gunners overhead stopped engaging rifle shooters entirely. There were too many. They focused exclusively on RPG gunners because those were the only real threat to the aircraft. At 4:40 p.m., Super 6-4 was orbiting the first crash site, providing fire support when an RPG struck it. The helicopter went down in another neighborhood, creating a second crash site that needed to be secured and defended. Task Force Ranger had barely enough troops to defend one crash site. Defending two was impossible, but the Americans would try anyway because they never left their own behind. That's what the Somali fighters were counting on. Another Black Hawk, Super 6-2, touched down near the second crash site. Two Delta snipers jumped out to protect the downed crew. 10 minutes later, an RPG smashed into Super 6-2. The explosion knocked the co-pilot unconscious, severed the leg of a Delta sniper manning the door gun, blew out the windshield, and destroyed the number 2 engine. The pilot kept it airborne long enough to make a crash landing back at the base. A third helicopter, Super 6-8, had been hit behind the cargo area in the main rotor section and engine. Shrapnel damaged the rotor blades. When it touched down at the airfield, it was inoperable for the rest of the battle. 3 helicopters damaged or destroyed by RPG fire. For weapons designed to kill tanks, they were proving devastatingly effective against American air power. At the first crash site, approximately 90 American soldiers consolidated their position. They occupied the crash site itself and several nearby houses, taking Somali civilians prisoner for their own protection. The houses provided cover, but they were also a trap. Every intersection leading to the crash site was covered by Somali fire. AK-47 rounds cracked overhead constantly, the distinctive pop of bullets passing close mixed with the whoosh of RPGs streaking past. Somali fighters fired from windows, from behind walls, from around corners. They weren't aiming carefully. They were laying down volume fire, making movement suicidal for the Americans pinned down. The Americans had taken approximately 20 Somali civilians prisoner in the houses they occupied. Mostly women and children, the crying of terrified children mixed with the moans of wounded American soldiers in adjoining rooms. One house had several children locked in a bathroom until soldiers let them rejoin their mothers. Colonel Sharif Hassan Jumale, one of Aidid's top commanders, knew exactly where the Americans were. He reportedly considered firing 60mm mortars into the houses, but at 9 p.m. an officer appeared with relatives of those held in the houses. They begged Jumale not to destroy the buildings with the civilians inside. Jumale decided to hold the mortars in reserve. The Rangers would be given a chance to escape. Some Somalis later stated they believed the only reason American forces weren't massacred that night was because they had taken women and children hostage. The American soldiers deny the civilians were hostages. They say the families were detained for security. But the tactical effect was the same. The presence of Somali civilians in those houses prevented the militia from using their most effective weapons. The quick reaction force back at the base scrambled to mount a rescue, but Task Force Ranger had come to Somalia with minimal armored support. They needed tanks and armored personnel carriers. The Americans had to request them from Pakistani and Malaysian UN forces. It wasn't until 11:15 p.m., 8 hours after the raid began, that the request for armor was made. A convoy of 70 vehicles was assembled. It drove into South Mogadishu and was ambushed repeatedly. 2 vehicles took a wrong turn near the old presidential palace. RPG fire destroyed them, killing a Malaysian driver and wounding several others. Not until 2 a.m. on October 4th did a unit from the 10th Mountain Division fight its way to the first crash site and link up with the trapped soldiers. Another unit reached the second crash site but found only blood trails. The 5 defenders, including the 2 Delta snipers who had volunteered to protect the downed crew, had been overrun. One, Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant, was captured alive. The others were killed. As dawn broke on October 4th, the Americans still needed to extract. The convoy couldn't hold all the soldiers. About 30 Rangers and Delta operators would have to run out on foot, moving alongside Malaysian armored personnel carriers through streets they knew would be hostile. The withdrawal was chaos. Somali fighters opened fire from every direction. The sound of bullets hitting the Malaysian armor was constant. RPG rounds slammed into vehicles. The Americans ran, firing as they moved, trying to keep pace with the armored vehicles. One Ranger shot in the shoulder during the running firefight described it watching an old Somali man, maybe 6 feet tall or more, walking through the street in a robe with a dead child slung over his shoulder. The man walked past bodies on the ground, stepping over them, oblivious to the gunfire. He had apparently walked through the city to find his grandson or son who had died in the fighting. That image stayed with the Ranger, the realization of just how many casualties had been inflicted on the Somali side. 17 hours after the raid began, all surviving American forces reached the stadium that served as a safe zone. The count began. 18 Americans dead, 84 wounded, 1 captured. The raid that was supposed to last 90 minutes had turned into the largest firefight American forces had experienced since Vietnam. Somali casualties were far higher. The Red Cross estimated approximately 1,000 Somali fighters and civilians were killed. Somali sources claimed 350 dead. The true number lies somewhere between, complicated by the fact that many wounded were taken to clan-controlled areas where no formal count was ever conducted. 2 days after the battle, on October 6th, Somali militia fired mortars at the American base. 1 Task Force Ranger soldier was killed and 16 wounded. Those were the final casualties of the deployment. Task Force Ranger never conducted another raid. President Clinton announced on October 7th that all American troops would withdraw from Somalia by March 31st, 1994. The hunt for Aidid was abandoned. U.S. representatives were sent to resume negotiations with the very warlord they had been trying to capture. Task Force Ranger departed Mogadishu on October 25th. The mission was over. The Battle of Mogadishu achieved what Aidid's forces needed. It broke American will to remain in Somalia. The sight of American casualties, particularly the body of a soldier being dragged through Mogadishu streets, shocked the American public. The cost of nation building in Somalia suddenly seemed too high. For Somali fighters, the battle was proof that a determined, numerically superior force with knowledge of local terrain could defeat even elite American troops. The key lessons were simple. RPGs could down helicopters. If you fired enough of them, American predictability could be exploited, and Americans would commit more forces to rescue downed pilots or trapped soldiers. Osama bin Laden later referenced the battle repeatedly, claiming it proved American soldiers were paper tigers, unable to endure casualties. When U.S. forces fled after taking losses, he said, it showed that defeating American will was possible. The quick withdrawal from Somalia after the battle would influence how America's enemies viewed U.S. resolve for decades. From a purely tactical perspective, Somali forces fought effectively by exploiting several American weaknesses. Task Force Ranger operated with minimal armored support in a hostile urban environment. Rangers came equipped for a short daylight operation, no night vision, minimal water and ammunition, reduced body armor. When the mission extended into night and became a rescue operation, they were unprepared. The American Quick Reaction Force lacked immediately available armor and had to request support from UN forces, creating an 8-hour delay before relief could arrive. During those 8 hours, Somali militia forces could reinforce positions, set up ambushes along likely rescue routes, and maintain constant pressure on trapped American forces. The RPG proved to be the decisive weapon. 3 helicopters hit in one day demonstrated that even sophisticated American air power was vulnerable to weapons available to militia forces. The psychological impact of watching Black Hawks fall from the sky galvanized Somali fighters and demoralized some American troops who had believed their technological superiority made them untouchable. But the cost was enormous on both sides. 18 American families lost sons, husbands, and fathers. Hundreds of Somali families experienced the same. The neighborhoods around the battle sites were devastated. Civilians caught in the crossfire died. American after-action reports identified multiple failures. Task Force Ranger had insufficient intelligence about the strength of militia forces in the target area. They lacked adequate contingency planning for helicopter losses. The decision to reduce body armor and not bring night vision equipment proved catastrophic when the mission extended past sunset. The absence of immediately available armored support meant trapped soldiers had to wait hours for relief. The fundamental mistake was underestimating the enemy. Somali militia forces were dismissed as poorly trained irregulars. In reality, they had studied American tactics for months, identified vulnerabilities, and prepared effective countermeasures. They used the urban terrain expertly. They demonstrated fire discipline by prioritizing helicopter threats. And they understood American doctrine well enough to predict how rescue forces would respond. For the Somali fighters, the battle became a defining moment. They had faced the most advanced military in the world and forced it to withdraw. The victory came at terrible cost, but it was still a victory. Operation Gothic Serpent, the overall mission to capture Aidid, was deemed a failure despite 6 previous successful raids. The catastrophic losses on October 3rd overshadowed everything else. Task Force Ranger could have been considered successful had they not conducted that final mission. Aidid had even sent messages indicating he was willing to negotiate before the raid. The battle demonstrated that superior technology and training don't guarantee victory in urban warfare when facing a determined enemy with numerical superiority, knowledge of terrain, and effective anti-aircraft weapons. Those lessons would be studied by military forces worldwide, particularly by groups planning asymmetric warfare against technologically superior opponents. Black Hawk Down, as it became known, marked the end of America's humanitarian intervention in Somalia and made Washington reluctant to commit forces to similar operations for years afterward. The quick withdrawal from Somalia contributed to American inaction during the Rwandan genocide the following year, where 1 million people were killed. For better or worse, what happened on the streets of Mogadishu on October 3rd and 4th, 1993, influenced how the United States approached military interventions for the next decade. 18 American deaths and the images of casualties being dragged through streets accomplished what months of militia operations could not. They ended American involvement in Somalia. The battle proved that wars aren't won purely through technological superiority or tactical excellence. They're won by the side that maintains the will to continue fighting regardless of cost. On that measure, facing enemies willing to absorb catastrophic casualties to achieve their objectives, American forces discovered there are limits to what technology and training can accomplish.